to see you, and I'm very excited to have this conversation today.
Me too.
And do it in the most beautiful environment.
It's so beautiful here.
Gorgeous. If you could just maybe tell me, because I've only done a little bit of introductory search on you and your work, if you could just tell us a little bit more about Project Neutral and Talk Climate to Me, that would be amazing.
Yeah, Talk Climate to Me is an online cohort-based course where we gather for 3 sessions. People all come together. There's team leads who are trained as facilitators to hold space for conversation after the main course, so about an hour of a course, then half an hour of chatting. And the amazing thing is that people come out of that telling us, you know what, I do feel confident talking about it now. And the incredible thing is I went and talked with my girlfriends or my sister or my cousin, and it turns out they care about this too, and I didn't even know. Because it has become polarized and because it's been framed as a science issue and you need to know all this technical knowledge, people hold back from talking about it. And so the whole purpose of Talk Climate to Me is to encourage people to talk with others, talk to their representatives as well. I'll talk with everyone in your network, including those in decision-making power, and people come away from it feeling inspired and grounded and like ready to actually go and take action.
I love that.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a lot of the work that I do in the gender-based violence sector, where we remind folks who have lived experience that that lived experience is considered expertise. It's not, you don't need to go to university and post-grad to learn about a specific issue. That channeling kind of that lived experience is considered knowledge, and that should be shared.
Whatever is the connection point, that is a lived experience that a lot of people care about, making the world safe for their children and for others, and just making it, are distressed by the inequities in the world. And if you care about that, cool. Climate change is also connected to that. You're allowed to talk about it.
And that's a great segue into our connection between climate change and gender inequity.
Yeah.
And I know that was, one of the main focal points of today's conversation.
Yeah.
And was wondering when you first, made that connection between gender and climate change.
As we were starting Talk Climate to Me, it really was prompted by this fact that, we're noticing, interesting, women are more concerned but feel less confidence. What happens if we gather, a group of women and allies together to talk about this? And then, of course, in doing that, we started looking at what are the other ways that gender is connected to climate change. And it's, on the one hand, it's distressing to see that there are a lot of ways that intersecting identities or vulnerabilities that come with the structural problems in our world can make people more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, including gender, including women. We know that often, particularly in the global south, who is more likely to go get water? Well, it's women and girls. And so as there are droughts and water becomes more difficult to access, they have to walk further and further, which makes it more likely that the young girls will be pulled out of school so that they can support their families in that, and then without having an education, that has all the cascading impacts for them later in life. The most troubling ways that this plays out here at home is the violence against Indigenous girls, women, trans women, Two-Spirit people that are associated with the extractive industries. So the risks that Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit people face when the extractive industries come in, set up the so-called man camps, which house temporary workers. They don't have a lot of connection to the place, and there's increase in violence, sexual violence, and even murders. And that's happening here in our country, and that it's kind of shocking that we have just allowed that to continue.
Yeah. Heart-wrenching to hear about this over and over again, but it's necessary to bring that conversation to the table.
It also it highlights the parallels between kind of the root causes. Many people have noted the relationship between colonialism and climate change, and that colonialism can be built, is built on these ideas of dominance over land, but there's really strong parallels with patriarchy and dominance over people's bodies, women's bodies, gender diverse people's bodies. And that dominance, that disconnection, all kind of, even though we might think on the surface that gender-based violence is over here and climate impacts are over here, the root causes, there's a lot of overlap with them.
Maybe shifting the conversation to the connection between gender-based violence and climate change.
Yeah.
And I know through these conversations that we've had, I would myself define those examples of gender inequity and climate change as gender-based violence and more systemically. People think of gender-based violence in terms of, it's just intimate partner violence or domestic violence. It's more at the individual level,
right.
But it can happen systemically, and those structural inequities that can exacerbate gender-based violence at the individual level
right.
and community levels. So I like that you touched on that, because even through not knowing it, we are talking about gender-based violence at that structural level, and how climate change actually reproduces
right.
those inequities that we see within community.
Well, and they often use the thing, and I believe it was the U.S. military who coined this term, but they talk about climate change as a threat multiplier. So it's where there are existing vulnerabilities or inequities at play, climate change basically just makes it worse. Some studies have shown, there's a study from South Asian countries that found that a 1 degree increase in temperature is associated with a 4.5% increase in intimate partner violence. And so there's really measurable changes as the world gets hotter, droughts are more common, it's harder on livelihoods, water stressors, all of these things that lead to these extra stressors, we actually see that playing out in terms of intimate partner violence and gender-based violence in general. And so, we have to prepare for the fact that warming has already happened and will happen. So hand in hand, while we are stopping the fossil fuel pollution, switching to cleaner alternatives that make people more comfortable anyway, and so on, we also have to be preparing for the destabilized weather patterns that we're experiencing already. And there is that really strong interplay between those larger structures and even things like intimate partner violence.
Right.
So we see after extreme weather events, when the event is happening, calls will go down because it's like an absolute crisis and it's just to stay alive. But as people start to return home, there's this sense of loss of power and loss of control. We know that in many cases, gender-based violence is a symptom or is exacerbated when people have that sense, the perpetrators have a sense of loss of powerlessness. And so what happens? Well, 6 months, a year after the actual extreme weather event, you get this major spike in calls.
You talking about unnatural disasters and events like that cause an uptick in cases and crisis calls. It makes me think of COVID and the impact of COVID. We as an organization saw an increase of 9,000% increase in crisis calls, where safety planning, high-risk cases, really there was an increase in terms of severity and where, the risks of femicide were very apparent in a number of cases. Making that connection between what we're seeing, because we are Canada-wide and we're seeing more impacts of climate change across the country, as you've noted, that we need to start making that connection between the number of calls that we're seeing and these events.
And planning for them.
And planning for them.
Yeah. It's making me think of, there's a wonderful scholar called Dr. Ingrid Waldron, and she's done a lot of really pioneering work on environmental racism, and she talks about there's structural determinants of health and kind of the outcomes that people face. There's gender aspects. There's lots of intersecting ways, including race and poverty and so on. But she talks about how these structural determinants can affect someone's exposure to climate risks. So if you live in a neighborhood, for example, if you live in a poor neighborhood, well, guess what? There's not as many trees there. So poor neighborhoods tend to be measurably hotter than leafy green, wealthier neighborhoods. That is not fair. and it has health implications in terms of people's ability to even survive a heat wave, but also just quality of life and so on. So there's some of these structural determinants can affect your exposure to climate risk, increase sensitivity to risk, and also decrease adaptive ability to adapt or respond to it. So if you don't have the means, again with the heat example, but like if you are a senior and you're in an apartment building and it's very hot, but the cooling center is a 15-minute walk away, well, how are you supposed to adapt to that? Or if you can't afford an air conditioner. So there's all of these structural ways that increase people's vulnerabilities to climate change. And so the same structures that lead to vulnerabilities for gender-based violence, like this broader definition of gender-based violence, like they also have connections to climate impacts as well. It's really easy to be hopeless in these times. Hope is a verb, like hope is active. I'm committed because I care, because I have love for others and the natural world, and to choose to be active, like in our hope, is actually like the most loving thing I think that we can do, because if we all sit back and just like wallow in the doom, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like the only thing that guarantees failure is us not doing anything.
Being able to imagine that and the potential in the action, I think that comes with that. So part of our work, and we always remind ourselves that, talking can only go so far. And I love, the conversation because I'm gonna take all of that in. But it's the action that follows it that's so impactful. And so what gives me hope is the community, and I think like building a community too, that you're now a part of for me is being able to have those conversations in safer spaces and to imagine a better world.
But if we say, oh, I care about this, I'm not going to be able to save everything, but here's where I can make a difference and I'm committed to that, I don't know, that's like a much more active or like visceral kind of gutsy kind of hope, and I don't know, I'm into that.
And I love, and I'll end with this, is the importance of connection. You brought up that hope is a verb, and I feel like we were already connected before we met. One of my pieces of research was on arts-based activism in the context of gender-based violence and focusing on strength. And what inspired me was an Indigenous artist named Christy Belcourt. But she talks about how within the Anishinaabe language that everything is verb-based. And so within the English language, things are always noun-based, like they're just things or static things. And within the Anishinaabe language, which is like so important, is this action piece. And so through my research, it was survivors' pieces of art and like bringing that and highlighting action from like what someone would consider that as like just a static piece. It was like there was so much movement and fluidity within it. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know that you're busy tackling all of this, and so I just really wanted to extend my gratitude for taking the time to be with me today.
Thank you. This has been such a great conversation. It's so fun to share ideas, and you've stretched my thinking and stuff, and I'm excited to like ponder more about the structural dimensions of gender-based violence and the connections.
So we'll ponder together because we will do some work together.
I like that. Yeah.
Perfect.
Sounds awesome. Yeah. Woo.